Chapter 1. Manafort. In 2007, Trump's future campaign manager, Paul Manafort, partners on an $850 million real estate deal with three men. Future Trump deputy campaign manager Rick Gates, a Russian oligarch considered an ally of Vladimir Putin, Oleg Deripaska, and a Soviet-born oligarch whom federal prosecutors call a Russian organized crime member, Dmitry Firtash. According to an October 2019 Daily Beast article, the deal involves the acquisition of New York City's Drake Hotel by laundering Firtash's ill-gotten oil and gas fortune, the implication being that Manafort and Gates are participating in laundering hundreds of millions of dollars for the Russian mob. Manafort and Gates's past involvement with the Russian mafia constitutes an immediate national security risk upon their hire by then-candidate Trump in March 2016. Manafort's business connection to the Russian mafia means, too, according to former CIA Chief of Russia Operations Steve Hall, that Manafort had been, at the very least, vetted by the Russians when he worked for former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine. Employment he discontinued just 24 months before applying to work for Trump's presidential campaign. Manafort had partnered with Deripaska and Firtash prior to 2007 as well. In 2006, according to the Associated Press, AP, Manafort signed a $10 million a year contract with longtime Putin associate Deripaska to covertly aid Putin in the United States. Manafort's charge was to greatly benefit the Putin government via unspecified political and economic efforts inside the United States. As part of his work for Deripaska, Manafort assisted Yanukovych in building the political might of Ukraine's pro-Kremlin Party of Regions. As reported by NBC News, Firtash, a top-tier comrade of Russian mobsters, was also a major financial backer of the Party of Regions. Deripaska, Russia's second richest man as of 2007, by his own public confession, does not separate himself from the state, meaning that he self-identifies as a Kremlin agent. In 2006, Manafort's first task for Deripaska and therefore Putin is, per The Atlantic, to see whether there was any hope of thwarting the democratic revolution that had swept through Ukraine in late 2004. The assignment bears an eerie resemblance to Manafort's efforts during the 2016 presidential campaign to damage Ukraine's reputation and retard its political progress. That Manafort's chief co-conspirator in Putin and Deripaska's mid-aughts conspiracy against Ukraine, Konstantin Kilimnik, a dual Russian-Ukrainian citizen with ties to a Russian intelligence service, will stand accused of being Manafort's right-hand man throughout his 2016 undermining of Ukraine while working on the Trump campaign, is yet another improbable coincidence. According to The Atlantic, after Manafort and Kilimnik's Ukrainian patron, then President Yanukovych, is deposed by pro-democracy forces in 2014, the two men are desperate to find a way to get their Party of Regions allies back to positions of power in Ukraine. To that end, they begin seeking a mechanism to gain lucrative access to the machinery of state in Ukraine. This mechanism arrives in the form of Donald Trump in 2016. As The Atlantic details, when Kilimnik flies from Ukraine to the United States, just as Trump is securing the GOP nomination for president in 2016, the Russian-Ukrainian citizen tells friends he has come to the United States for very significant meetings. And it isn't hard for his friends to intuit what he means, having read the news reports that Paul Manafort had engineered his own comeback, procuring a top job in the Trump campaign. Just like in the good old days in Ukraine, Manafort had summoned Kilimnik to trail after him. That the course of Manafort's contract to aid Putin via political efforts inside the United States includes his management of the 2016 Trump campaign and, critically, the many months of private Trump-Manafort political discussions following Manafort's August 2016 departure from the campaign is confirmed by U.S. media reports that Manafort told Deripaska agents in early 2016 that he would seek to use his work with Trump to get whole with Deripaska financially. In 2006, the same year Manafort signs a contract to advance the Kremlin's interests in the United States, he moves into the very New York City building Trump lives in, Trump Tower. Manafort has already known Trump for decades when he moves into the building where Trump's office and personal residence are located. Indeed, Trump was Manafort's first client when the latter began his political consulting business with future Trump presidential advisor Roger Stone in 1980. While Manafort does not own the Trump account in 1980, that honor goes to Stone. A partner in the firm at the time will later say that Manafort would often, when Trump's account was being discussed, dispense advice and pitch in, a practice routine enough that in short order, Manafort finds himself, per his former colleague, winning Trump's trust. Manafort himself will say in 2016, somewhat cryptically, that Donald Trump and I had some business in the 1980s. Manafort and Trump develop a sufficiently close relationship in the early to mid-1980s that when Manafort is deputy convention manager for the 1988 Republican National Convention, he issues a special invitation to Trump to come to the Louisiana Superdome to see how a convention is really run, per U.S. News and World Report. The two convened in a trailer outside the Superdome during a steamy weekday for a friendly chit-chat. Enough respect develops between the two men that by the time Trump taps Manafort to be a major player in his presidential campaign in March 2016, Manafort is, according to GOP operative Scott Reed, Trump's peer, not someone Trump can bully and boss around. Manafort's daughter Andrea will refer to her father's relationship with candidate Trump as the most dangerous friendship in America in a text, while her sister Jessica in another text will write that Dad and Trump are literally living in the same building, and Mom says they go up and down all day long hanging and plotting together. Trump remains a Manafort client from 1980 through the early 1990s, notes the national security expert-staffed website Just Security, with the two men having mutual close friends, mutual local political interests. Both Manafort and Trump were active in the New Jersey political scene in the 1990s. Mutual lobbying interests. Both men were involved in lobbying Capitol Hill on Indian gaming issues. And mutual business interests. In 2006, Manafort became involved in the Manhattan real estate scene. By Manafort's admission, in at least one instance, he performs work directly for Trump, helping to clear noisy airspace over Mr. Trump's Florida resort Mar-a-Lago, per the New York Times. According to the Hartford Courant, by 1993, Trump is saying publicly that he is very loyal to Manafort and Stone's consulting firm, which he notes has represented him over the years. In 2001, Manafort meets and goes into business with Julius Nasso, a man who in 2003 will plead guilty to federal extortion charges, with the two associates' matchmaker being none other than Trump himself. Trump is sufficiently close to Nasso that before the latter enters into an agreement to make a film with well-known Broadway producer, real estate investor, and politician Abe Hirschfeld, he asks Trump's opinion of the man. I checked Hirschfeld out with Donald Trump, Nasso told the New York Post in 1999, and Donald said he was a nice guy. Manafort has been working primarily for and in Ukraine for 2 years at the time he purchases his Trump Tower condo in November 2006 for $3.675 million, the funding for which purchase therefore almost certainly comes in part or entirely from his millions in Kremlin-backed earnings. According to Slate, Manafort sees and speaks to Trump in Trump Tower with some regularity from November 2006 onward, with the digital media outlet noting that when Manafort took an apartment in Trump Tower in 2006, he would kibitz with his old client when they'd run into one another. While the subject of these informal chats is unknown, both men are at the time deeply immersed in high-end real estate, even as the contract with Deripaska that Manafort had negotiated required Manafort to, as the Associated Press describes, influence business dealings inside the United States to benefit President Vladimir Putin's government. In the same year that Manafort, by this time one of Ukraine's top political operatives, becomes a tenant of Trump Tower, Trump suddenly develops a powerful interest in Ukraine. As Politico notes, it is only 8 months after Manafort and Deripaska begin discussing in mid-2005 what Manafort can do for the Kremlin via business dealings in the United States that Trump's children Don and Ivanka traveled to Ukraine to meet face-to-face with government officials. It is in the same month, February 2006, that Trump fixer and Russian mob-linked operator Felix Sater gives Don and Ivanka a guided tour of Moscow, at Donald Trump's request, according to the Washington Post, and arranges for Ivanka to not only access Putin's private office in the Kremlin, but sit in his chair. Exactly how Trump's 2 eldest children gained direct access to Manafort's co-workers in the Ukrainian government in February 2006 is unclear, though their chief topic of discussion in Kyiv is well known: a multi-million-dollar hotel and golf course in the country. The discussions Don and Ivanka have with government officials in the Ukrainian capital are serious and fruitful enough that as late as 2 years later in 2008, as Trump is considering whether to run for president in 2012, Don goes back to Ukraine to meet with potential developers for the project. It is also in 2008 that Manafort creates a real estate development team, CMZ Ventures, with, among others, Brad Zaxxon, the longtime right-hand man and exclusive broker and manager for Donald Trump's father, Fred Trump, when the latter was running the original Trump Organization. Zaxxon is, per Commercial Observer, a New York City real estate publication launched and owned by Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, a man so linked to the Trump family that he had literally gained access to New York society's inner circle through the Trumps. Just as Manafort manages to regularly kibitz with Trump by living in Trump Tower, the Ukrainian political operative is able to befriend Trump's father's right-hand man by becoming his neighbor in the Hamptons. It is Manafort's second real estate purchase, putting him in the orbit of the Trumps while he is under a Kremlin-backed contract. Zaxxon would, in the 2000s, invest in several of Manafort's business projects, even as, according to Just Security, the latter developed a reputation in professional and social circles as a man with an uncanny ability to conjure investors, such as Ukrainian billionaire gas king Dmitry Firtash, according to a 2011 panegyric in Kushner's Commercial Observer. Years later, Manafort would get hired by the 2016 Trump campaign in substantial part based on the recommendation of Jared and his wife Ivanka. Manafort's 2008 Drake Hotel venture with Oleg Deripaska, Dmitry Firtash, and Fred Trump's fixer Brad Zaxxon quite nearly involved Trump himself, according to Kushner's paper. Commercial Observer writes that Mr. Manafort met with Ukrainian billionaire Mr. Firtash, a part owner of Ural Transgas in Kyiv, and secured the promise of an initial $112 million for the project. But that fell apart when Mr. Firtash became distracted by an investment in troubled bank Nadra back home. Grasping, Mr. Zaxxon wrote in an email in March 2009, "I have an idea to bring Donald Trump in on the Drake. I think it solves a lot of issues right away." How far the longtime Trump family friend got in connecting Ukrainian political operative Manafort, Ukrainian oligarch Firtash, Russian oligarch Deripaska, and future U.S. President Donald Trump as business partners is unknown. What is known is that after Manafort's boss Yanukovych was ousted from power for the first time in 2007, his successor, the reformer Yulia Tymoshenko, unsuccessfully alleged in a lawsuit that Firtash used the joint Manafort-Zaxxon-Firtash venture CMZ as a front in order to hide income illegally skimmed from his natural gas company, Ros Ukr Energo, an outfit whose revenue comes in substantial part from the Kremlin-owned gas company Gazprom. Timoshenko further alleged that the real owner of Ros-Ukrenergo was infamous Russian mobster Semyon Mogilevich, a man who employed Trump attorney Michael Cohen's father, allegedly made longtime Cohen friend Felix Sater one of his main American liaisons, per the Daily Beast, and helped Dmitry Firtash get his start in business, according to statements by Firtash to William Taylor, a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Reuters reports that Ros-Ukrenergo was plagued for years by accusations it was a wholly unnecessary middleman between Russian and Ukrainian gas concerns, existing only to enrich Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs at the expense of the Ukrainian government. That Donald Trump quite nearly ends up in a business venture in 2009 with Zaksin, Manafort, Deripaska, Firtash's energy interests, and, indirectly, the Putin-controlled Gazprom will become relevant to his impeachment a decade hence, as the latter event has at its heart all five of those elements: Manafort, Deripaska, Firtash's energy interests, and Gazprom. The Manafort-Firtash deal isn't Trump's only near miss in Ukraine, nor are Manafort and Zaksin the only longtime Trump Organization associates with whom Trump crosses paths in the former Soviet Republic. One of the Trump's agents in Ukraine in the mid to late 2000s, during the years Manafort was making powerful connections there, was none other than Sater, who not only came close to closing a Trump Tower Moscow deal for Trump in 2005, but would infamously, with then-candidate Trump and Trump's attorney Michael Cohen, have Trump sign a mid-presidential campaign letter of intent on a second Kremlin-approved Trump Tower Moscow plan in 2015. While the level of Sater's involvement in Trump's mid-aughts to mid-teens attempt to do business in Ukraine is uncertain, the Trump Organization's track record in the region at the time suggests Trump may have felt he had cause to be upset with his agents in Ukraine, Ukrainian officials and businessmen, or both. In 2006, per popular New York City real estate website The Real Deal, Trump reportedly demanded $20 million to put his name on a proposed high-rise development in Moscow. Ukrainian-Russian developer Pavel Fuchs met with Trump several times in 2005 and later with his daughter Ivanka and son Donald Jr. to discuss a Trump-branded tower in Moscow. Fuchs apparently offered the Trump Organization $10 million for the branding rights, but Trump demanded $20 million. Ultimately, no deal was reached. The same year, Trump worked with another of his several real estate agents in Ukraine, Dmitry Buryak, on what he hoped would be a multi-million-dollar real estate project in the country. Buryak, like Sater, was at the time simultaneously scouting for business opportunities for Trump in Russia. According to Politico, the deal Trump hoped to do in Ukraine, still in active negotiation in 2008, just 48 months before he decided to run for president in 2016, was a substantial one. Per the digital media outlet, Yevhen Chevenyenko, then the Ukraine Minister of Transportation, was quoted in 2005 as saying Trump's expected financial contribution to the project was estimated to be $500 million. Politico reports that the Trump Organization also considered building a hotel and yacht club in the seaside city of Yalta, which is now part of the Russian-annexed area of Crimea in Ukraine. While it is unclear what role, if any, Trump's well-connected tenant Paul Manafort played in the Trump's multiple prospective deals in Ukraine and multiple trips there to advance them, Politico reports that the Ukrainian government granted the Trump Organization the right to build properties in both cities, Kyiv and Yalta. The digital media outlet adds that it is unclear why neither project, the $500 million deal or the Fuchs deal, got off the ground. An especially curious development given that some reports suggest Trump had the option to, instead of putting up $500 million of his own money in the former deal, license the Trump Organization's name and receive royalties from any Ukraine project instead of owning the properties, a model the Trump Organization follows in many locations around the globe. Whatever the basis of this or other aborted Trump business plans in Ukraine, in November 2019, the Republican counsel for the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, Steve Castor, will submit during a televised impeachment hearing that Trump had for years harbored genuinely deep-rooted concerns about corruption in Ukraine stemming from his business dealings in the region. Attorney Castor does not specify which corrupt Ukrainian deals, businessmen, politicians, or political operatives Trump found himself close to in the 2000s, nor does he explain what sort of corruption could trouble a man who, in 2012, called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which prohibits Americans from bribing foreign officials to advance business deals, ridiculous and horrible. Indeed, there is evidence that Trump's initial interest in Ukraine was predicated upon its corruption rather than diminished by it. In the 2000s, while Buryok is running a company, D-Vision, that bills itself as one of the largest real estate businesses in Ukraine, the Ukrainian is also a vice president at Petrochemical Holding, an entity whose managing director had been convicted not long before Trump began using Buryok as his in-country agent for crimes committed while he was working at Russian government-owned energy giant Gazprom. The corruption at Petrochemical Holding hadn't been limited to Buryok's peers in upper management either. According to Politico, Buryok himself was being investigated around the time Trump was doing business with him for allegedly funneling money from Russian special services, Russian intelligence, to political operations in a former Soviet republic. That republic, Lithuania, would later issue a formal finding that Buryok posed a threat to the interests of Lithuania, particularly with respect to political and electoral interference. Trump's ties with Manafort, at a time the political consultant was a significant figure in a corrupt Ukrainian presidential administration, also undercuts contemporary claims by Trump or his allies that corruption in Ukraine had long been a concern of the president's. Manafort's patron, Yanukovych, was Ukraine's prime minister for 16 months, from August 2006 through December 2007, before his eviction from office. Mere months later, Trump's son entered Ukraine to continue business negotiations his father had initiated while Yanukovych's political star was still rising. By 2008, therefore, Buryok, Manafort, and Yanukovych all had become potential political liabilities for Trump, not because of Ukraine's corruption, but because of their own. And not because Ukraine had done nothing to combat their corruption, but because it had done all it could. Indeed, Trump could not have failed to note that his business fortunes in Ukraine waned concurrent with the rise of anti-corruption forces in Kyiv, particularly in the person of reformer Yulia Tymoshenko, who was elected Ukraine's prime minister, succeeding Yanukovych in 2007. Prior to Tymoshenko's election, the Trumps had excellent access to the government in Kyiv, with Don and Ivanka's February 2006 trip involving a meeting with Viktor Tkachuk, advisor to then Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko, as well as Andriy Zaika of Ukrainian Construction Consortium, a newly formed construction company. By the time of Trump Jr.'s June 2008 return trip to Kyiv, however, he was meeting only with Buryok's peer developers at D-Vision, a meeting from which no deal resulted. As Sater would put it in a 2008 deposition while speaking in particular of the business opportunity the Trumps pursued in Yalta, it didn't get to the finish line. Though Politico numbers at only 2 Trump's failures in Ukraine, one in Kyiv and one in Yalta, in fact, the number is at least 4. Sater testified under oath that he was looking at multiple opportunities for the Trumps in Yalta, and Politico distinguishes between a failed Trump Organization project involving the $60 million Europark Hotel in Kyiv and a second project, a proposed golf club in Koncha Zaspa, a neighborhood in southern Kyiv. These missed opportunities stand alongside a host of similarly unrealized Trump Organization projects in former Soviet republics in the 2000s and 2010s. As Politico notes, Trump's broader push in the former Soviet Union never resulted in any completed properties. Trump pulled out of a deal to develop a 47-story luxury tower in the Black Sea resort town of Batumi, Georgia, and a Trump high-rise in Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, remains unfinished. The reason Manafort still needs to get whole with Deripaska when he volunteers to work for Trump pro bono in 2016 is that his business dealings with the Russian oligarch since 2006 have not, in fact, been exclusively pursuant to their year-to-year contract. In March 2007, Manafort and Deripaska co-founded Pericles Emerging Market Partners, a Cayman Islands-based private equity fund. It is through Pericles that Manafort, Gates, Deripaska, and Firtash aimed to purchase the Drake Hotel in 2008. In 2011, when Tymoshenko, by then no longer Ukraine's prime minister, unsuccessfully sues Manafort and Firtash, alleging that the Drake Hotel deal was a vehicle to launder illegal funds, she is in the midst of being prosecuted by Ukraine's new presidential administration, one headed by the man she supplanted as prime minister in 2007, longtime Manafort boss Viktor Yanukovych. The charges Tymoshenko faces under the Yanukovych administration are decried as politically motivated in statements from both the United States and the European Union, and Tymoshenko's resultant 7-year prison sentence is overturned in 2014 after a court finds that, in fact, she committed no crime. Whatever the full story of the Pericles and Drake Hotel projects, what is clear is that by 2011, Manafort is so deeply in debt to Deripaska for having squandered the latter's tens of millions of dollars in investments that he has no choice but to stop responding to Deripaska's efforts to reach him. Deripaska subsequently sues Manafort for business behaviors marked, according to Deripaska, by fraud, gross negligence, blatant disloyalty, and rapacious self-dealing. Yet there is reason to doubt that Manafort's only anxiety with respect to Deripaska as he begins his work on the Trump campaign relates to financial debts. As The Atlantic will report in June 2018, Manafort knew in 2016 that Deripaska had a reputation that justifiably inspired fear, given the pattern of deaths that had followed the unlikely rise of his business empire in the 1990s. The possibility Manafort joined Trump's campaign as a man in fear for his life is therefore due serious consideration. As The Guardian has reported, right after Manafort joined the Trump campaign in March 2016, he and Kilimnik began emailing and brainstorming about avenues to escape the Deripaska litigation threat and improve ties with the powerful oligarch. Manafort's now infamous entreaty to Trump friend Thomas Barrack to help him access the businessman's presidential campaign, "I really need to get to Trump," Manafort had told Barrack in late February 2016, suggests the desperate straits the former power broker was facing at the time. Manafort's business associations with Dmitry Firtash in the 2000s may have been slightly less fraught than those he shared with Deripaska, but they are no less relevant today. According to Mother Jones, by the time of Trump's inauguration, Firtash had spent years cutting deals with Russia's state-owned gas company, Gazprom. The question of whether the money Firtash received from Gazprom was ill-gotten, part of a long course of suspicious payments to Firtash that Russian President Vladimir Putin had orchestrated, arises not only in the 2019 Trump-Ukraine scandal, but also in the most controversial component of Special Counsel Robert Mueller's earlier Trump-Russia investigation, the so-called Steele dossier, compiled by former MI6 Russia desk chief Christopher Steele in 2016 with indirect funding from Republican and Democratic entities. Steele's MI6-derived sources alleged in 2016 that the Kremlin had promised money from Gazprom's coffers to then-candidate Donald Trump. When the Trump-Ukraine scandal breaks in the United States in mid-2019, one of its key open questions is whether two individuals paid by the Gazprom-connected Firtash, Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman, have been illegally funneling money to Trump or pro-Trump entities, an allegation that, if true, would closely resemble the raw intelligence compiled in Steele's dossier. Based on Trump and Manafort's interactions in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, Just Security will conclude in 2017 that Trump and Manafort have been crossing paths for decades. As for how frequently the two interacted once Manafort was brought aboard the Trump campaign, the national security news outlet quotes a source close to the 2016 Trump campaign as saying that during the campaign, Trump was calling Manafort like 20 times a day. New York Magazine and the Weekly Standard report that from the time Manafort joined the 2016 campaign, he was firmly in charge of all major aspects of Trump's campaign and asserting an active role in shaping the direction of the campaign and the candidate. Manafort was even one of the few people in Trump's political orbit permitted to call him Donald. These and like accounts paint the picture of a presidential candidate and campaign manager with such a long history and enjoying such intimate in-campaign interactions that if one of the two engaged in illicit collusive behavior, for instance, if Manafort was found, as he was by the April 2019 Mueller report, to have transmitted in mid-campaign proprietary campaign data to Oleg Deripaska via the Russian intelligence-linked Kilimnik, there would be good reason to imagine Trump knew of such activities at the time or learned of them eventually. So it is that in January 2018, as Manafort is under federal indictment in multiple jurisdictions, NBC News reports that Trump is telling friends and aides in private that one of the chief reasons things are going great for him is that he's decided that a key witness in the Russia probe, Paul Manafort, isn't going to flip and sell him out. Partly for this reason, Trump has determined that he will be able to, if need be, crush Robert Mueller without firing him as special counsel. Left unexplained in NBC News' reporting is what element of Manafort's dealings with Trump or Trump's knowledge of his campaign manager's dealings with Ukrainian and Russian oligarchs in the 2000s and 2010s could be used by Manafort to harm the president. There is, therefore, a paradox at the heart of President Trump's ongoing concern for Manafort's fate in the federal courts and the federal prison system. Trump tells reporters in June 2018 that Manafort's plethora of federal charges has nothing to do with our 2016 campaign, even as Manafort has, over the preceding 18 months, been regularly in secret contact with both the president and his political team regarding federal investigations of that very campaign. The 2019 Ukraine scandal will bring this paradox into even higher relief, as the president spends much of 2017, 2018, and 2019 publicly fuming over investigations of Manafort, his words and demeanor indicative of a man who believes he is being personally attacked. Indeed, during the October 2019 congressional testimony of Ambassador to the European Union Gordon Sondland, Representative Devin Nunes, Republican California, a top Trump ally, implies that Trump's now infamous May 2019 complaint about the Ukrainian government, "They tried to take me down," referred to Manafort-related leaks to the press in the summer and fall of 2016. After Manafort's first felony convictions arrive in August 2018, Trump applauds his former campaign chief for not being willing to make up stories to avoid federal prison, implying that he believes one of the foremost purposes of the Manafort investigation has been to inculpate America's president in as yet unspecified federal offenses. This belief may explain why, the day after Manafort's deputy Rick Gates pleads guilty in federal court on February 23, 2018, Trump, per reporting in the Washington Post, seemed anxious about the development. He began asking aides whether Manafort might also cooperate with the investigation and whether the former campaign chief knew of anything that could hurt him. Left unanswered in this query is how Trump could be unsure whether a longtime associate could inculpate him. Likewise unanswered is the question of why, per the Mueller report, Manafort told Gates days before Gates flipped on the Trump campaign in February 2018 that he should instead sit tight, because Trump agents had assured Manafort that he and Gates would be taken care of by Trump's people if they remained silent. Whatever its source, what Trump's anxiety over Manafort's legal difficulties underscores is how important it is to the president in 2018 and 2019 that neither American nor Ukrainian investigations of his former campaign manager put sufficient pressure on the veteran political operative that he sells out Trump as part of a federal cooperation deal, a flip. But it will take certain key details of the Ukraine scandal, which do not emerge until early 2020, to fully illuminate the source of the president's obsession with the Ukrainian power broker who managed his 2016 presidential campaign.